Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
"Give me the keys," Julian Vance snapped, his voice echoing through the marble foyer. "You don't look like you belong in a car like this anyway." Elena Vance stood her ground, her fingers tightening around the leather fob of the vintage Mercedes. She had driven 6 hours from the city, leaving behind her caseload of foster children and the cramped apartment that smelled of radiator fluid, only to be met with the same suffocating arrogance she had fled 5 years ago. Julian didn't wait for her to respond. He stepped into her personal space, the scent of expensive sandalwood cologne and aged scotch rolling off him in waves. He looked every bit the CEO of Vance Global, tailored Italian silk suit, hair swept back with surgical precision, and eyes that saw people only as assets or liabilities. To him, Elena was clearly the latter. "I said, hand them over," he repeated, his voice dropping to a dangerous, low register. "That car was Father's pride. It belongs in the showroom, not parked in the mud by a girl who spends her days in government slums." Behind him, Marcus Thorne stood by the grand staircase, his expression unreadable as he polished his spectacles. The family lawyer had always been a fixture of the estate, a silent observer of the Vance family's slow rot. Beside him, Silas, the estate's longtime groundskeeper, clutched a silver serving tray, his knuckles white. Silas caught Elena's eye for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something warning or pity passing between them before he looked down at his boots. "The car was left to me in the preliminary trust, Julian," Elena said, her voice remarkably steady despite the drumming of her heart. "I'm here for the reading of the will, nothing more." Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that bounced off the vaulted ceiling. "The will? You think you're getting a piece of this. You walked away, remember? You traded the Vance name for a social worker's badge and a sense of moral superiority. You don't get to come crawling back now that the coffers are being opened." He reached out, his hand hovering inches from her blazer, a thrifted piece that suddenly felt painfully thin under his scrutiny. "Look at you. You look like the help. In fact, why don't you go help Silas in the kitchen? It's the only part of this house where you might actually fit in." A soft, shuffling sound came from the top of the stairs. Beatrice Vance appeared, draped in a heavy pashmina, her gaze wandering aimlessly over the foyer. The matriarch of the family looked fragile, her face a mask of confusion. "Is it time for tea, Julian?" Beatrice asked, her voice thin and airy. She didn't even look at Elena, her eyes tracking a phantom speck of dust in the air. "The gardeners are being so loud today." "Not now, Mother," Julian said, his tone shifting to one of patronizing patience. He turned back to Elena, the mask of the dutiful son vanishing instantly. "She doesn't even know who you are. To her, you're just another stranger trying to pick the pockets of a dying empire." Elena felt a surge of heat rise in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her face. She had spent years de-escalating violent outbursts in cramped tenement halls. Julian's brand of psychological warfare was amateur by comparison. She reached into her pocket, her thumb brushing the cold, metallic edge of the small digital recorder Silas had mailed to her 2 weeks ago. It was a silent weight, a secret power Julian couldn't possibly fathom. "I'm going to my room," Elena said, stepping around him. Julian's hand shot out, grabbing her upper arm. His grip was tight, meant to assert dominance. "You don't have a room here anymore. I turned your suite into a humidor 3 years ago. You'll stay in the servants' quarters in the East Wing if you stay at all." "And Elena," she paused, looking at his hand until he slowly released her. "Don't get comfortable," he sneered. "Marcus and I have already reviewed the stewardship clauses. By tomorrow afternoon, you'll be back in your little cubicle and I'll be the sole head of this estate. You were always the weak link, Elena. Father knew it, I know it, and soon the whole world will know it." He turned on his heel, gesturing for Marcus Thorne to follow him into the study. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing like a gavel. Elena stood alone in the center of the foyer. The house felt colder than she remembered, the shadows of the ancestors' portraits stretching long and jagged across the floor. She looked up at the staircase where Beatrice was still wandering, humming a tuneless melody. Silas approached her then, his footsteps silent on the marble. He didn't speak, but as he passed to take a tray of glasses toward the study, he leaned in. "The study walls are thick, Miss Elena," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the ticking of the grandfather clock. "But the vents in the East Wing library are thin. If I were you, I'd be interested in what the CEO and the lawyer are discussing before the sun goes down." He moved away before she could thank him. Elena felt the weight of the recorder in her pocket again. Julian thought she was a beggar coming for scraps, a sleeping lion he could poke with impunity. He had no idea she hadn't come for the money. She had come for the truth. She turned toward the East Wing, her pace deliberate. The game had officially begun, and Julian had just made his first, most arrogant mistake. He assumed she was playing by his rules. She wasn't. An hour had passed since the sun began its slow descent behind the jagged peaks of the estate's horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the velvet curtains of the East Wing. Elena Vance moved with the practiced silence of someone who had spent years navigating rooms where she wasn't wanted. The library was a cavern of dark oak and the scent of aging parchment and expensive cedar oil. It was a room designed to intimidate, but she didn't look at the gold-leafed spines of the books. Instead, she knelt by the ornate brass vent near the baseboards of the far wall. The metal was cold against her fingertips, a sharp contrast to the heat of the anger simmering in her chest. She pulled the digital recorder from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the button. "She's a relic, Marcus, a drain on resources we don't have." Julian's voice drifted through the ductwork, thin but unmistakable. The sound of ice clinking against crystal punctuated his words, the casual rhythm of a man discussing a business merger rather than his own mother's life. "Beatrice Vance still holds the majority of the voting shares, Julian," Marcus Thorne replied, his tone cautious, legalistic. "Even with the dementia diagnosis, the will is ironclad. Unless she's declared incompetent by a state-appointed board, you can't touch the principle of the trust." "Then we accelerate the timeline," Julian snapped. Elena heard the heavy thud of a glass being set down on a mahogany desk. "She's wandering the halls humming to herself. She doesn't know what year it is. I'm the one keeping this family's legacy from drowning in the debt I've had to manage." Elena's grip tightened on the recorder. Julian's management was the reason the Vance name was whispered about in the city's financial districts with a mixture of pity and suspicion. He had bled the estate dry to fund a lifestyle of private jets and failed tech investments, and now he was looking for a final payday at the expense of the woman who had given him everything. "And what about your sister?" Marcus asked. "Elena is back, if she sees the state of the accounts before the gala." Julian let out a sharp, mocking laugh that made Elena's skin crawl. "Elena, my sister is a glorified babysitter for the poor. She spent the last decade living in a studio apartment with a leaky ceiling. She's here because she's broke and looking for a handout. I'll toss her a few thousand to go back to her social work and she'll thank me for the scrap. She has no idea what's actually happening. She doesn't have the stomach for this world, let alone the bank account." He was so certain. That was Julian's greatest weakness, his absolute, unshakable belief that money was the only form of power that mattered. He didn't know that Elena hadn't just been working in the trenches of social services. She had been learning how to dismantle systems from the inside. She leaned her head against the cool wood of the shelving. Julian thought she was a beggar. He didn't know about the Lotus Group, the anonymous investment firm that had been quietly buying up the Vance Group's predatory debt for the last 18 months. He didn't know that the bleeding heart he despised was technically his largest creditor. "The Founders' Gala is in 3 days," Julian continued, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hum. "I've already invited the board. By the time the champagne is poured, Beatrice will be signed into the Evergreen facility, and I'll be announced as the sole conservator. Elena will be lucky if I let her keep her childhood bedroom for the weekend." "It's a risk," Marcus said. "It's a win," Julian corrected him. "The woman is a shell. She's gone, Marcus. I'm just tidying up the paperwork." Elena switched off the recorder. The silence of the library felt heavy, charged with the weight of the betrayal she had just captured. Julian wasn't just stealing an inheritance, he was trying to erase a human being. She stood up, smoothing the fabric of her modest wool coat. She looked at the door leading back to the main hall, where the grandfather clock chimed the hour. 3 days. She reached into her bag and pulled out a burner phone, typing a short message to a contact listed only as S. The gala is the target. Ensure the audit is ready for Friday night. I want the full paper trail on the embezzlement. She walked toward the window, watching the moonlight silver the manicured lawns. Julian Vance thought he was the wolf at the door, but he had forgotten one thing about the Vance bloodline. He wasn't the only one who knew how to hunt. He had spent years poking the lion, convinced it was sleeping. He was about to find out that she had been wide awake the entire time, just waiting for him to step into the light. Elena turned away from the window, her expression as cold as the brass vent. The countdown had begun, and Julian had no idea that the sister he planned to dismiss was the one who already held the keys to his kingdom. 2 days later, the air in the valley had turned sharp and biting, a precursor to the winter that always seemed to arrive early at the Vance estate. Elena sat in a corner booth of a roadside diner 5 miles from the manor, the scent of burnt chicory and old rain clinging to the vinyl seats. Across from her, Silas looked older than he had 48 hours ago. His weathered hands, stained with the permanent grease of a man who had spent 40 years maintaining the Vance fleet, trembled as he slid a small, silver thumb drive across the Formica tabletop. The old man didn't speak at first. He watched the steam rise from his black coffee, his eyes darting toward the window as if expecting a black sedan to pull into the gravel lot. He had been the estate's groundskeeper and mechanic since Elena was a child, the only one who had ever offered her a kind word when the walls of the manor felt like they were closing in. "It's all there, Elena," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. The shell companies, the offshore transfers, and the falsified maintenance records for the foundation's housing projects. He didn't just steal the money, he let those buildings rot while he pocketed the repair funds. He's been betting against the family legacy for years. She reached out, her fingers closing over the cold metal of the drive. The jagged edge bit into her palm, a grounding sting that fueled her resolve. "Thank you, Silas. I know what this cost you. It cost me my peace of mind a long time ago, watching him dismantle everything your father built," Silas said, finally meeting her gaze. "Be careful. Julian doesn't just discard people. He crushes them so they can't get back up." Elena tucked the drive into the hidden lining of her coat. "He's forgotten that I was raised in the same house. I know exactly how he thinks." By the time she returned to the manor, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the manicured lawn. The house was a hive of frantic activity. Caterers were arriving, unloading crates of crystal and silver for the following night's gala. The sound of heavy crates hitting the marble floors echoed through the foyer like distant thunder. She found Julian in the grand library, standing over Marcus Thorne. The lawyer looked exhausted, his glasses perched on the bridge of his nose as he reviewed a stack of legal documents. Julian, however, looked invigorated. He was draped in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Elena's annual salary, a glass of amber scotch in one hand and a gold fountain pen in the other. "Sign it, Marcus," Julian snapped, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who had never been told no. "I don't pay you to provide moral commentary. I pay you to ensure the Vance transition is seamless. My mother is in no position to dictate terms anymore." Marcus sighed, his voice thin. "The matriarch still has legal standing, Julian, if she were to have a moment of clarity." "She won't," he interrupted, a predatory smirk playing on his lips. He turned as he heard Elena's footsteps, his eyes raking over her modest wool coat with visible revulsion. "Ah, the prodigal sister returns. Still dressed like a scholarship student, I see. Did you spend your afternoon at the soup kitchen, or were you out looking for a dress that doesn't smell like a thrift store?" Elena didn't flinch. She walked to the sideboard and poured herself a glass of water, her movements deliberate and calm. "I was taking a walk, Julian. It's important to appreciate the view while you still have it." He let out a sharp, mocking laugh and stepped toward her, invading her personal space. The cloying scent of his expensive cologne, something heavy with oud and arrogance, filled the air. Enjoy it while it lasts. I've just finished the final draft of the new estate bylaws. Tomorrow night, at the gala, I'm announcing the restructuring of the Vance Foundation. You'll be given a very generous severance from the family name, enough to buy a small apartment far away from here. Perhaps you can go back to saving the world on someone else's dime. You seem very confident for a man who hasn't seen the final audit, she said quietly, sipping her water. Julian's expression shifted, a flicker of something dark and volatile crossing his features before his mask of entitlement slid back into place. He stepped even closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. I am the audit, Elena. I've spent 5 years cleaning up the mess our father left behind while you were out playing martyr. You think you can come back here and claim a seat at a table you abandoned? You're a stain on the family crest, a glorified panhandler with a famous last name. He reached out, flicking the collar of her coat with a sneer. Tomorrow night, I'm cleaning house, and that includes moving Beatrice to a specialized facility in the city. She's a senile burden, and I'm done pretending she's still the head of this family. The rage flared in Elena's chest, hot and sharp, but she channeled it into the weight of the thumb drive in her pocket. She looked him dead in the eye, her voice as cold as the brass vents in the floor. You've always underestimated the people in this house, Julian. You think power is something you sign into existence with a gold pen, but power is knowing the truth, and the truth is a very patient hunter. Julian smirked, draining his scotch. He didn't see the way Marcus Thorne's hands paused over the papers, or the way the lawyer's eyes darted toward Elena with a sudden, sharp interest. 24 hours, Elena. That's all you have left of the Vance name. I'd suggest you start packing tonight. It's a long fall from the top of the hill, and I'd hate for you to trip on your way out. He turned on his heel, the rhythmic, metallic ticking of his expensive watch the only sound in the room as he walked away. Elena watched him go, her hand resting over the drive. The countdown was no longer in days, but in heartbeats. Tomorrow, the wolf would find out that the gates were already locked, and he was on the wrong side of the bars. The next morning, the conservatory smelled of bitter orange marmalade and the sharp, clinical scent of fresh floor wax. Sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling glass, illuminating the fine layer of dust dancing around Julian Vance as he sat at the head of the breakfast table. He looked every bit the king of a crumbling empire, draped in a silk robe that cost more than the annual budget of the community center where Elena worked. She stood by the sideboard, her fingers tracing the cool, polished marble. She hadn't slept. The weight of the encrypted drive in her pocket felt like a physical heat against her hip. Across the room, Beatrice Vance sat in her floral armchair, her gaze fixed on a hummingbird hovering just outside the glass. She appeared lost in the fog of her own mind, though Elena noticed the way her grandmother's tea sat untouched, the steam long gone. "You're still here," Julian said, not looking up from his tablet. He sliced into a poached egg with surgical precision. "I assumed you'd be halfway to the bus station by now. Or do social workers get a special grace period for being evicted?" "The 24 hours aren't up yet," Elena replied, her voice steady. She poured herself a cup of black coffee, the aroma bitter and grounding. "I thought I'd stay to see the transition. It's not every day a legacy changes hands." Julian finally looked at her, his lips curling into a smirk that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. "Legacy is a strong word for what you're losing. You're trading a mansion for a cubicle, Elena, but I suppose some people are just born for the mud." He turned his attention to Sila's, who was silently clearing a side table. "Sila's, make sure her bags are on the porch by noon. I don't want her lingering like a bad smell when the auditors arrive this afternoon." The first rage spike hit Elena then, a hot, sharp prickle behind her eyes. Julian wasn't just taking the house, he was trying to strip her of her dignity in front of the man who had seen her grow up. Silas paused, his eyes darting toward her for a fraction of a second, filled with a quiet, helpless apology before he bowed his head and continued his work. "The auditors," Elena mused, taking a slow sip of her coffee. The liquid was scalding, but she didn't flinch. "You seem very confident about what they'll find, Julian. It's a bold move, inviting the wolf into the den to count the sheep." He laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "I am the wolf, sister. I built the fence, I own the sheep, and I wrote the ledger. There is nothing in this house that doesn't answer to me. Even the shadows, she asked quietly. Julian paused, his fork hovering midair. What is that supposed to mean? Just a thought. You've spent so much time looking at the numbers on the screen that you've forgotten the walls have ears. She walked toward the table, leaning in just enough for him to catch the scent of her determination. The trial of stewardship wasn't just about who could grow the capital, Julian. It was about who could protect the foundation. You've been so busy renovating the penthouse that you didn't notice the dry rot in the basement. He set his cutlery down with a sharp clink against the bone china. The sound echoed through the glass room like a gunshot. You're talking in riddles because you have nothing left. No cards, no allies, and no name. By tomorrow, you'll be a ghost. A ghost can walk through locked doors, she whispered. She turned to leave, but stopped by Beatrice's chair. She placed a hand on her grandmother's shoulder. The older woman didn't move, but her hand shifted slightly, covering Elena's for a brief, crushing second. It was a signal, a silent confirmation that the stage was set. As Elena walked toward the door, she saw Marcus Thorne standing in the foyer, his briefcase clicked shut. He looked at her with an expression that was no longer dismissive, but profoundly alert. He had seen the way she handled Julian's venom, and for the first time, the lawyer looked like a man who realized he might have bet on the wrong horse. The board meeting is set for 9 a.m. tomorrow, Marcus said, his voice echoing in the hall. The final signatures will be required then. Elena nodded, her gaze shifting back to Julian, who was already back to his tablet, oblivious to the storm gathering in the humidity of the morning. I wouldn't miss it for the world, Marcus. After all, every great play needs a final act. She climbed the stairs to her room, the countdown echoing in her mind with every step. 12 hours until the sun went down. 21 hours until the truth became a fire that Julian Vance couldn't put out. She closed her door and pulled the drive from her pocket, the small plastic casing glinting in the light. The wolf thought he was clearing the house, but Elena was simply making room for the wrecking ball. The morning of the board meeting arrived with the sharp, clinical precision of a guillotine blade. By 8 a.m., the library of the Vance estate had been transformed into a temporary war room. The scent of expensive beeswax polish and old parchment hung heavy in the air, mingling with the bitter aroma of over-roasted espresso. Elena Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, her fingers tracing the cold velvet of the curtains. She wore a tailored navy suit, sharp, professional, and utterly devoid of the charity case chic her brother loved to mock. In her pocket, the small plastic casing of the flash drive felt like a live coal against her hip. She wasn't just a social worker today, she was the architect of a collapse. The heavy oak doors creaked open, and the sound of polished Italian leather clicked across the parquet floor. Julian Vance entered the room like a man already crowned. He was adjusting his cufflinks, a pair of platinum wolves that caught the morning light with a predatory glint. "Still here, Elena," Julian said, his voice a smooth drawl that set her teeth on edge. He didn't look at her. He was too busy admiring his reflection in the glass of a bookcase. "I half expected you to have packed your bags and retreated to whatever hovel you call home by now. It would have saved us both the public embarrassment of the next hour." Elena turned, her expression a mask of practiced serenity. "The board is early, Julian. You should check the coffee service. It's a bit acidic." He finally looked at her, his lip curling in a sneer that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Always the little helper. It's charming, really. But after today, your services won't be required. I've already instructed Silas to change the codes on the main gate the moment the signatures are dry. You've had your fun playing at being a Vance, but the adults are taking over now." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, the scent of his cloying, expensive cologne, something with notes of oud and arrogance, filling her lungs. "You look like you're heading to a deposition for a slumlord, not a multi-billion-dollar transition. Try not to speak unless Marcus Thorne asks you a direct question. We wouldn't want the board to realize the family bloodline has thinned so significantly on your side of the tree." Elena didn't flinch. She actually smiled, a slow, thin curve of the lips that made Julian's eyes narrow. "I'll keep that in mind. I wouldn't want anyone to be surprised by what happens in this room." The arrival of the board members cut the tension like a knife. 5 men and 2 women, all dressed in varying shades of charcoal and power gray, filed into the library. They were the gatekeepers of the Vance legacy, and they looked at Elena with the polite, distant pity one might afford a dying breed of bird. Marcus Thorne followed them, his leather briefcase looking heavy with the weight of the final documents. He caught Elena's eye for a fraction of a second, a nearly imperceptible nod passing between them before he took his place at the head of the long mahogany table. "Where is our matriarch?" one of the board members asked, a man named Henderson who had been on the board since Elena was in diapers. "My mother is resting," Julian said, taking the seat opposite Marcus with a flourish. "The strain of the last few weeks has been significant. She has given me full proxy to conclude these proceedings. She's eager to see the company move into a more modern era." In the corner, Silas stood as still as a statue, his hands folded in front of him. He caught Elena's gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something other than stoicism in the old man's eyes. It was anticipation. "Very well," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "Before we move to the final signing of the stewardship transfer, Julian has requested a brief presentation on the projected restructuring of the Vance holdings." Julian stood up, his posture radiating a terrifying level of confidence. He walked to the head of the table, tapping a button on his tablet that synced with the large monitor mounted on the library wall. "Thank you, Marcus. Gentlemen, ladies, today isn't just about a change in leadership. It's about a purge. We are trimming the fat, starting with the legacy, charity, wings that have bled our margins for a decade." He glanced at Elena, a triumphant smirk dancing on his face. "We are a wolf pack, not a sanctuary, and wolves don't share their kill with those who haven't earned a seat at the table." As Julian launched into a dizzying array of charts and figures, Elena felt the room's temperature seem to drop. He was brilliant in a cold, calculating way. He was selling them a future built on the bones of their father's promises, and the board was nodding. They were buying it. They liked the idea of higher dividends, even if it meant gutting the soul of the company. Julian hit a slide titled Asset Liquidation, Phase 1. "And here," he said, his voice rising with theatrical flair, "is where we begin the true growth. By offloading the underperforming estates and community centers, we free up nearly $400 million in liquid." "Julian," Elena interrupted. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had the clarity of a bell in a silent cathedral. The room went still. Julian froze, his finger hovering over the tablet. He turned slowly, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson. "Elena, I believe I told you to stay silent. This is a board meeting, not a town hall for the disgruntled." "I think the board would be interested in the source of those liquidation figures," Elena said, standing up. She walked toward the table, her heels clicking with rhythmic finality on the wood. "Specifically, the offshore accounts linked to the Vance Thorne subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, the ones that don't appear on the official ledger." The silence in the room changed. It was no longer the silence of listening. It was the silence of a predator sensing a trap. Marcus Thorne didn't move, but his grip on his pen tightened until his knuckles turned white. Julian let out a short, bark-like laugh. "Offshore accounts? Elena, your imagination is as poor as your fashion sense. Marcus, please remove my sister. She's clearly having some sort of emotional episode." "I'm not going anywhere, Julian," Elena said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the flash drive and held it up. The small blue light on the casing flickered like a heartbeat. "And neither are you. Not until we discuss why 12% of the company's R&D budget has been diverted into a private shell company called Lupin Holdings over the last 18 months. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to hollow out. The smugness vanished, replaced by a raw, jagged panic that he tried to mask with a shout. "That is enough! Security! Silas, get her out of here!" Silas didn't move. He didn't even blink. Elena walked to the monitor, her hand steady as she reached for the port. She looked Julian directly in the eye, seeing the exact moment the wolf realized the cage door had been locked from the outside. "You wanted a final act, Julian," she whispered, loud enough only for him to hear. "Well, the curtain is going up." She plugged the drive into the system. The screen flickered, the charts of projected growth disappearing, replaced by a single, high-resolution scan of a bank transfer authorization. At the bottom of the document, in bold, unmistakable ink, was Julian's signature. "Wait," Henderson said, leaning forward, his eyes widening as he read the numbers on the screen. "That's the pension fund." Elena didn't say a word. She just hit next. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the low, mechanical whir of the cooling fan in the projector. Julian Vance looked at the screen, and for the first time in his life, the silver-tongued CEO had nothing to say. The high-resolution scan of the bank transfer didn't just show his signature. It showed the timestamp, the IP address of his private office, and the destination, a shell company in the Cayman Islands registered under his middle name. Julian's face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically erode. The vibrant, sun-kissed tan of a man who spent his weekends on a yacht turned a sickly, curdled gray. A single bead of sweat tracked a jagged path from his temple, carving through the expensive foundation he used to hide his late nights. His lower lip developed a rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch that made his smug mouth look like a dying fish, gasping for air that was no longer his to breathe. His eyes, usually sharp and predatory, went wide and glassy, darting around the room as if looking for a secret door that didn't exist. He looked smaller, the tailored shoulders of his $4,000 suit suddenly appearing 3 sizes too large for the collapsing man inside. "Julian," Henderson's voice was a low growl. The older board member stood, his chair screeching against the polished hardwood like a dying animal. "That's the employee pension fund. My father's pension is in that fund. It's a fabrication." He finally found his voice, though it was thin and reedy, a ghost of his usual baritone. He lunged toward the laptop, his fingers clawing at the air. "She's a social worker. She's a nobody. She hacked the system to frame me because she's bitter about the will." Marcus Thorne stepped into his path, his expression as immovable as a tombstone. "The documents were verified by the estate's independent auditors an hour ago, Julian. The digital trail is unbroken." Across the table, Beatrice Vance sat perfectly still. She didn't look at the screen. She looked only at her son. There was no dementia in her eyes now, only a cold, devastating clarity. She looked at him the way a scientist might look at a failed experiment or a gardener at a rotted root. She didn't say a word, but the way she slowly pulled her hand away from where it had rested near his arm spoke volumes. It was a silent excommunication. Silas remained by the door, his massive arms crossed, a shadow that he could no longer command. 2 other board members were already on their phones, their voices hushed but urgent, using words like compliance and authorities. The smell of expensive cologne in the room was being overtaken by the sharp, acidic scent of a man's mounting panic. Elena Vance didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She stood at the head of the table, the place he had guarded like a fortress, and looked down at him. She felt the weight of the years of his dismissive sneers and his cruel jokes about her charity work evaporate. "I didn't come here for the money, Julian," she said, her voice cutting through his frantic stammering like a blade. "I came here because I knew you were destroying the only thing our father actually cared about, the people who built this company." "You're nothing," he hissed, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table. "You're a guest in this house. I am the CEO." "Not anymore," Marcus Thorne interrupted, sliding a single sheet of paper across the mahogany. "The morality clause in your contract is quite specific regarding the misappropriation of company funds. By unanimous vote of the present board members, your ties to Vance International are severed, effective immediately." He looked around the room, searching for an ally, a friend, a bribe he could still pay. He found only the backs of heads as people turned away from his sinking ship. Elena picked up her bag, her movements slow and deliberate. She had seen enough. The wolf wasn't just in a cage, he was being stripped of his fur in front of the pack. "You spent so much time worrying about who sat at the head of the table," she said, pausing at the door as Silas opened it for her. That you forgot to check who owned the house." She didn't wait for his reply. She didn't need to hear the excuses or the begging that she knew would follow. As she stepped out into the cool evening air of the hallway, the sound of the boardroom door clicking shut behind her felt like the final period at the end of a very long, very dark sentence. The silence of the executive hallway lasted exactly 4 seconds before the boardroom doors burst open behind her. Elena Vance didn't stop walking. She could hear the frantic, uneven rhythm of Julian's expensive loafers slapping against the polished marble, a desperate sound that lacked his usual predatory grace. The scent of floor wax and stale air felt heavy, pressing against her as she reached the bank of elevators. "Elena! Elena Vance! You stop right there!" Julian's voice was a jagged shard of glass, stripped of its corporate sheen. He reached out, his hand trembling as he tried to grab her shoulder, but Sila's stepped between them with the silent efficiency of a stone wall. Elena turned slowly. Her brother looked unraveled. His silk tie was crooked, and a dark spot of sweat had begun to bloom through the fabric of his bespoke shirt. He looked less like a CEO and more like a cornered animal, his eyes darting toward the closed boardroom doors where the echoes of his ruin still lingered. "You think a board vote changes anything?" Julian hissed, his voice dropping to a low, venomous crawl. "I am the Vance name. I am the legacy." "You're just a social worker who crawled back for a handout. That vote was a farce, and I'll have it overturned by morning. You have nothing." "I have the truth, Julian," she said, her voice a calm, chilling contrast to his hysteria. She reached into her bag and pulled out a single, heavy vellum envelope. "And Marcus is waiting downstairs with the rest of it." "Marcus Thorne is a lapdog," Julian spat, though his eyes locked onto the envelope with a flicker of genuine fear. "He does what the head of this family tells him to do, and that is me." "Is it?" The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to reveal Marcus Thorne. He wasn't alone. Standing beside him, draped in a coat of charcoal wool and leaning only lightly on her cane, was Beatrice Vance. The air in the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian Vance's face didn't just pale, it seemed to physically deflate. His jaw hung slack, a rhythmic twitch starting under his left eye as the reality of the figure before him took hold. The arrogance that usually held his shoulders high vanished, leaving him hunched and trembling. His breath came in ragged, wet hitches, the sound of a man drowning on dry land while his empire turned to dust. His eyes, usually sharp with predatory intent, became glassy and unfocused, darting between his mother and the documents Marcus held as if the words might change if he looked away and back again. A thin sheen of sweat broke across his forehead, and his lower lip began a frantic, uncontrollable tremor that he tried to hide by biting it, only to draw blood. "Mother," Julian stammered, his voice breaking. You aren't supposed to be here. The doctors said." "The doctors said what you paid them to say, Julian," Beatrice said, her voice clear and resonant, devoid of the fog he had tried to trap her in for years. She stepped out of the elevator, her gaze raking over him with a cold, clinical detachment that was more devastating than anger. "I may have been aging, but I was never blind. I watched you pick the bones of this company clean while you thought I was staring at shadows." Marcus stepped forward, unfolding a document embossed with the family's private seal. "The board's vote was the first step, Julian. This is the second. In light of the evidence of embezzlement and the attempted medical kidnapping of a family member, the Vance estate is invoking the trial of stewardship clause." "That's an ancient relic," Julian shouted, his hands curling into fists. "It's not legal. It is when the majority shareholder signs it," Elena Vance said, stepping toward her mother. She took the elder woman's hand, feeling the strength in those thin, parchment-like fingers. 2 security guards, men Julian had hired himself only months ago, stepped out from the shadows of the reception desk. They didn't look at him. They looked at Marcus. "Mr. Thorne?" one of them asked. "Mr. Vance is to be escorted from the premises immediately," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the vast, sterile hallway. "He is barred from all Vance International properties. His personal accounts associated with the firm have been frozen pending a full forensic audit." Julian turned to the guards, a wild, hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. "You work for me. I sign your checks." "Actually," the guard said, his face a mask of professional indifference, "the signatures on our contracts belong to the estate, and the estate just gave us a new order." Julian lunged toward Elena, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You did this. You poisoned her against me. You came back here to steal what I built." Silas didn't have to move much. He simply shifted his weight, and Julian hit him like a bird hitting a window. The guards moved in then, catching Julian by the arms. They didn't use excessive force, but the clinical way they handled him, as if he were nothing more than a piece of discarded luggage, was the ultimate humiliation. "Wait!" Julian screamed as they began to drag him toward the service elevator. "Mother, Elena, you can't do this. I'm a Vance." Elena watched him go, her expression unreadable. She listened to the sound of his heels scuffing against the floor, a dying echo of the power he had once wielded so cruelly. The scent of Beatrice's lavender perfume filled the space Julian had occupied, a clean, sharp scent that signaled the end of a long winter. "He'll try to fight," Marcus warned softly, watching the elevator doors close on Julian's fading screams. "Let him," Beatrice said, turning her back on the hallway. "He'll find that when you build a house out of lies, there's nothing left to stand on once the truth comes out." Elena looked at the empty hallway, the silence finally returning, but it was a different kind of quiet now. The weight she had carried since her return hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. "Silas," Elena said, her voice steady, "make sure his personal items are sent to a hotel, not the penthouse, a hotel." "Which one, Miss Elena?" "The one by the airport," she said, thinking of the modest rooms Julian had always mocked. "The one with the plastic sheets and the thin walls. I think it's time he learned what it feels like to be just a guest." She turned and walked back toward the elevator with her mother and Marcus, the click of her heels sounding like a gavel. The reckoning was over, but the rebuilding was only just beginning. As the doors closed, Elena caught her reflection in the polished brass. She wasn't the girl who had run away anymore. She was the woman who had come home to take it all back. 3 months had passed since the heavy brass doors of the Vance estate had clicked shut behind the disgraced former CEO. The seasons had shifted, the sweltering tension of summer giving way to a crisp, unforgiving autumn that painted the grounds in shades of rust and gold. Elena Vance sat in the high-backed library chair, the same one her father had favored, watching the wind whip the fallen leaves across the manicured lawn. The silence in the house was no longer heavy with secrets. It was simply quiet. The scent of fresh lavender and beeswax now permeated the halls, a deliberate erasure of the heavy, expensive tobacco and cloying cologne that had once marked her brother's territory. She ran a thumb over the edge of a thick manila folder. It contained the final audit of the Vance Foundation, a document that proved the bleeding had stopped. The millions Julian Vance had siphoned into offshore accounts were being clawed back, cent by cent, through a series of grueling legal maneuvers led by Marcus Thorne. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. Silas entered, carrying a silver tray with a single porcelain cup. He moved with a lightness she hadn't seen in years, his shoulders no longer hunched as if expecting a blow. "The gardener finished the north hedge, Miss Elena," he said, setting the tea down. His eyes flickered to the window. "And there is someone at the perimeter gate, again." Elena didn't need to ask who it was. She stood, her silk trousers whispering against the rug, and walked to the monitors in the corner of the study. On the grainy screen, a man stood huddled against the wind. His designer wool coat, once a symbol of untouchable status, was stained and frayed at the cuffs. Julian looked smaller than she remembered. The arrogance that usually puffed out his chest had collapsed, leaving behind a jagged, hollow frame. He was arguing with the intercom, his gestures frantic and jerky. "He's been at that airport hotel for 12 weeks, Silas murmured, his voice devoid of pity. "The management called yesterday. His credit cards were finally declined. He tried to tell them he owned the building. They laughed in his face before putting his suitcases on the sidewalk." Elena watched her brother on the screen. He was the man who had once told her she was a guest in her own life, a charity case who didn't deserve the Vance name. Now, he was the one begging for entry into a world that had moved on without him. She touched the intercom button, but didn't speak. She just listened to the muffled sound of his voice through the speaker. "Elena, I know you're in there." Julian's voice was thin, cracking with a desperation that tasted like iron. "This has gone far enough. Mother wouldn't want this. You're making a spectacle of the family. Just give me enough for a deposit on an apartment. I'm a Vance, for God's sake." "You were a Vance," Elena said, her voice cool and steady, cutting through his tirade. "Now you're just a man who forgot that a name is a responsibility, not a shield." On the screen, he froze. His mouth opened, then closed, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized he wasn't talking to the sister he could bully. He was talking to the woman who held every card in the deck. "I have nothing," he whispered, his bravado finally shattering. "Elena, please, it's freezing out here." "The hotel by the airport is still open, Julian. I believe they have a room with plastic sheets and thin walls. It's within walking distance if you start now." She cut the feed. The screen went black, plunging the room back into its peaceful, quiet state. She turned back to the desk, but the victory didn't feel as bright as she had imagined it would. It felt heavy. Later that afternoon, she found Beatrice Vance in the sunroom. Her mother was draped in a cashmere shawl, staring out at the rose bushes that were being pruned for the winter. The matriarch's eyes were clear, the mask of confusion she had worn for years completely discarded. She looked like a woman who had survived a war only to realize she was the only one left on the battlefield. "He's gone, Mother," Elena said, sitting on the ottoman at her feet. Beatrice reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she stroked Elena's hair. "I know. I heard the gate." She sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "I spent 40 years building a dynasty, only to watch my son try to burn it down for a few extra zeros in a bank account. I thought I was testing you both, Elena. I didn't realize I was merely waiting to see which one of you would survive the other." "The foundation is secure," Elena promised. "The staff are being looked after. The Vance name means something again." "It means justice," Beatrice said, her voice a fragile whisper. "But it no longer means family." Elena looked at the empty chair across from them. She had won. She had the house, the fortune, and the legacy. She had stripped the predator of his claws and restored the honor of her ancestors. But as the sun began to set, casting long, lonely shadows across the marble floor, she realized the cost of the crown. The house was finally clean, but it was also very, very empty. She was the woman who had come home to take it all back, and in doing so, she had realized there was no one left to share it with. She picked up the childhood photograph on the side table, 2 children laughing in the summer sun, and turned it face down. The rebuilding had begun, but the girl who had run away was gone forever.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.